And we bow and we bend from the beginning of the world till the never end. O Devo Shalom Aleinu, O Devo Shalom Aleinu, Devo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Good evening, everybody. It's really nice to see you, and really nice to be here. This is an important subject that we're dealing with tonight, which I think will hopefully generate a lot of discussion amongst yourselves, and hopefully with you and your friends, and certainly with me continuing, because this is something that I think has been sort of unknown by too many people, because they're not involved in interfaith work all the time. And these things are important to recognize. So tonight we're talking about how do Jews feel about Jesus? But in order for me to do that, we're actually going to have to start with the Jewish attitude about the Messiah, our understanding of Messiah, because we are both messianic peoples, and we have different views about what that means. So I'm going to begin to share my screen. Okay. So we need to go back to actually not just the Babylonian exile, but even more than that. We need to go back to the destruction of the temple. Hold on. The destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in the year 586 BCE, before the Common Era, or BC, as many of you call it. So it was huge for the Jewish people. This is a little quote from a wonderful website that I highly recommend to learn more about Judaism and Jewish perspectives. The Babylonian exile had a grave impact on Israelite religion. The temple was destroyed. The eternal Davidic dynasty interrupted, and the people driven from the land Yud-He Vav-He Adonai Yahweh had given to them. Little is known about religious life during the exile, except that solemn days were designed to mourn the loss of Israelite institutions. The prophets attempted to soothe the pain of these losses by promising a glorious restoration. Okay, well, let's take a couple of steps back first. So this is Solomon's temple that we're talking about. This is the temple that was built not by David, but by Solomon, because David was considered to have too much blood on his hands by the prophets of his day. And so he was not granted the privilege of engineering the temple in Jerusalem, but Solomon, his son, did that. Now, we need to understand that even though that research has demonstrated that there was Jewish practice all over Israel at that point, people were even building their little altars and making sacrifices and so on and so forth, that all of that was really not permitted, that the only institution that was supposed to have prayer in it on that uninterrupted basis was the temple in Jerusalem. And when the Babylonians destroyed it, not only was the symbol gone, but a whole big component of Jewish theology was short-circuited. The temple was considered to be God's home. It was considered to be a mechanism that enabled God to be present amongst the people, that not only present amongst the people, but of course present in the world, and that without this magnet, without this device, which is really in some way how they saw the temple, that God was not present, that God was alienated from the world because the temple had been destroyed. And so that's why we get such incredible literature out of the Book of Lamentations. Um, um, uh, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. So why did we sit down and weep? We sat down and wept because the temple had been destroyed and God wasn't there. So this was a moment when God became portable. God became portable. God became something that something. Yeah, I think something is better than someone. Something. The spiritual force of the universe was able to travel with us. This was a new idea in the world that your God could be anywhere that we were. That God could be anywhere in not only just the world but the universe. That it didn't need a home, didn't need a statue, didn't need any religious symbolism. And so things really, really, really changed, although there was still a huge longing to go back to the land of Israel. And when that happened, about 50 years later under Cyrus the Great, people had established themselves so vigorously in Babylonia that they stayed in the Babylonian Empire. Some of them did, at any rate. Most other Jews went back to the land of Israel, where the temple was rebuilt. And the policies, the politics of Israel, both internally and externally, were always kind of up in the air. They were like something being juggled, never quite landing in a firm way, which made the land of Israel very vulnerable through the years. And no matter how strong they might have been, very few countries at later, several centuries later, about 4 or 5 centuries later, could resist and rebuff the Romans. So Roman occupation began in the 1st century BCE and continued on afterwards. And while they were there, religious life in Israel adjusted. But while they were in Babylonia, a seed was planted. And you know this verse from Isaiah. You know it well because you use it in your church's theology as well. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government is upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor of the Mighty, Mighty God, of the Everlasting Father, of the Prince of Peace. Now, he wasn't called the Prince of Peace, he was of the Prince of Peace. Just note the language in the verse. And what's important here is this is the seed upon which the understanding of the Messiah is born. It comes from, and it's a marvelous verse. It's a beautiful verse, but you need to hear it in context. This is the prophet Isaiah talking to the Babylonian exiles, telling them that despite what has happened, that the Davidic dynasty, because it's played out elsewhere in the scriptures, the Davidic dynasty will continue. A child will be born to that dynasty. He will become the head of the government, and we will get our sovereignty back. This is reinforced. Here it is. This is what happened when we left Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. This is what was going on in the minds and the hearts of the people at that time. Isaiah throws in this hope, this comforting verse, and the idea of a Messiah is born. Now, Messiah comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, so it's an anglicized version of Mashiach, as you may know. And Mashiach does not mean Lord. It does not mean king. It means anointed one. Now, it is true that kings and other royalty were anointed in the ancient world, but that is exactly why it's Mashiach. In other words, the king of Israel was always going to be a Mashiach in days past and days future, because the king of Israel would always be welcomed in with a ceremony of anointing with fragrant oil. And so it's not it's, you know, for the Jewish people, it wasn't an old word, but it was a word of focus when they didn't have a king and when they were exiled in a foreign country. Now, the Messiah is also come from the stock of Jesse, that is King David's father. This is again from Isaiah. And again, this is his waxing poetic and telling the Jewish people, here's what's coming. We're going to get a Mashiach. We're going to get back to our homeland, and we will never, ever, ever lose our sovereignty again. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by what his eyes see, nor decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and decide with equity for the humble of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. Now, again, as Jesus is portrayed in the New Testament, you can see where the tablecloth was sort of laid out to set that table for him. It's right here, although that was not Isaiah's intention. Isaiah's intention was about a flesh and blood king who would lead the Jewish people and enable the Jewish people again to be strong and secure in their land, also be a person of deep faith, also be a person who could judge with righteousness. Also supposed to be a great warrior. Now, after the second temple was destroyed, I know we're moving around a lot, but after the second temple was destroyed, arose a man named Bar Kokhba, right? We have no idea why it became Ben Koziva in the Talmud, excuse me, in the Book of Lamentations, but indeed it did. Bar Kokhba. You know, how great was the strength of him against Rome? Now, he would intercept the stones shot by the Roman catapults with one of his knees, heave them back, and so on and so forth. Bar Kokhba was the leader of this revolt against the Romans. You can see about 60 years after the temple was destroyed in the year 70. About 60 years after that, they launched an unsuccessful revolt against the Romans, and he was the leader. We're going to see some other things about it, but more than likely he was slain in battle. And so note what happens though. When Rabbi Akiba beheld Ben Koziva, he exclaimed, a star, a Kochav has risen out of Jacob. Going back to the book of Numbers, Koziva has risen out of Jacob. He is the king Messiah, meaning that he is indeed this new flesh and blood king who will lead the Jewish people back to their security. We talked about him being a skilled judge as well, but this is important. I really love this. Bar Koziva ruled for 2.5 years and then said to the rabbis, I am the Messiah. They answered, it is written that the Messiah can judge by smell. Based on what we read before, this is, by the way, very rabbinic. I'm sorry about my little typo that's coming. Very rabbinic how the rabbis don't take anything for granted. Note what was said in Isaiah 11:3. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, nor decide by what his ears hear. So what's left? His sense of smell. Could have been his sense of taste as well, but or touch. But here it's they insert the sense of smell, and they said, well, Bar Kochba, Bar Koziva, let us see whether Bar Koziva can do this. And when they saw that he could not judge by smell, they killed him. Now, this is a person who claimed that he was the Messiah. And the rabbis said, nobody claims to be the Messiah unless you really are the Messiah. And if you are the Messiah, you'll be able to judge by smell. And he couldn't. And the legend is that the rabbis killed him. They really didn't, of course. He really did die in battle. The Messiah's arrival depends upon the people of Israel. This is again from the Talmud. Rabbi Alexandri, you can see how Greek culture moved its way into Jewish culture in the ancient world, said, Rabbi Joshua contrasted two verses. It is written, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven. Okay? These again are going to be phrases that are picked up in the establishment of Christianity. And another verse says, behold, your king comes to you, humble and riding on an ass. And you have that vision as well for Jesus' return, yes, to Jerusalem. If Israel merits it, he will come with the clouds of heaven. If not, he will be humble and riding on an ass. So the Messiah depends upon the way in which the Jewish people is behaving, right? And you're going to see how that gets extended later. Now, this too is a very, very, very common vision within Judaism. Now, Elijah, why is Elijah the prophet? Said to be the harbinger or the precursor of the Messianic age. The reason is because Elijah didn't really die, as you might recall. Elijah was taken to heaven in a chariot of fire, hence the movie. So he's kind of eternal. And so the notion is that he is sitting with God, waiting for the time when the Jewish people will deserve to have the Messiah. In other words, deserve to have their leader who will take them back secure to the land of Israel. Again, this has nothing to do with other kinds of transcendent ideas. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi asked Elijah, when will the Messiah come? Go and ask him himself. Where is he sitting? At the gates of Rome. What will identify him? He is sitting among the poor lepers, while all of them untie all their bandages at once and rebandage them together. He unties and rebandages each separately before treating the next, saying, I might be needed, so I must not be delayed. In other words, I might be needed to reveal myself, right? And so he says, don't interrupt me. I'm gonna take care of you, but we've got to keep going because I have to. I may be called at any moment to identify myself as the Messiah. Again, the king who will lead the Jewish people. This also becomes, by the way, an image for Elijah, that Elijah could be the blighted beggar, the homeless person who's clearly schizophrenic and not relating to the world, etc. Okay. Also, the Messiah is supposed to be a scholar. And this has to do with attitudes about the Torah. And you may know that some of the gospel writers had a tendency to downplay the importance of the Torah, to make a difference between Judaism and Christianity as Christianity was developing. Excuse me, a resolute commitment to the commandments, was replaced by one's believing in Jesus and being saved. And so they leaned on that quite frequently. And in some ways, now Maimonides, by this time we're talking about the Middle Ages, he's pushing back. Christianity obviously is already extant and has been for centuries, but he's pushing back about the Messiah, and he says, if a king from the house of David studies Torah, busies himself with the commandments like David did, observes the laws of the written and oral law, convinces Israel to walk in the way of the Torah and to repair its breaches, and fights the battles of the Lord, it may be assumed that he is the Messiah. Note again that this is a scholar king. This is not a ethereal, angelic kind of presence. It's not. It's not someone who is anything but a flesh and blood king. If he succeeds at these things, rebuilds the temple on its site, and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is beyond all doubt the Messiah. But if he does not succeed fully or is slain, it is obvious that he is not the Messiah promised in the Torah. So what is Maimonides doing? Maimonides is laying out requirements for someone to be the Messiah. Those requirements, would be not only these, as it turns out, but the whole idea of the Messiah got expanded. It got inflated way beyond anything that Isaiah was talking about, way beyond anything that Maimonides was talking about, through the establishment of the Christian church. Now, my movement, the Reform movement, made a small linguistic change in a prayer, the first blessing of the central prayer in Jewish liturgy, as is noted at the bottom. We changed the word goel, redeemer, to geulah, redemption, meaning that what we are waiting for is not a personage, but rather an age, a time period that will be ushered in not by a person, but rather by some of the steps that were outlined before. If the Jewish people merits this new age, it will come. If we don't, it won't. Even at this time, the Reform movement was a little bit religiocentric, one might say ethnocentric, and said that all of this depends upon the behavior of the Jewish people, not all people universally. That would later change, but for this moment in 1885, when the Reform movement was just establishing itself, really, not only in the United States, but literally in the world, even though it had some kind of an embryonic beginning in Germany, this was the statement of the rabbis who started the movement in 1885. Now, this one is really beautiful. Arthur Green is a kind of a non-denominational rabbi, and I love his stuff. This is a little time dated, so I'm sorry about that, but it still works really well. This is another vision, and this shows you how the concept of the Messiah within Judaism has been, was prophetically defined by Isaiah and others, and then began to get folklore attached to it, and other ideas attached to it, other possibilities. Instead of bringing about the onset of redemption, Messiah will herald its completion. The actual work of redeeming the world is turned to us in history and is done by all of us. This is not Jews alone, day by day. Messiah has been, pardon me, has been waiting in the wings, as it were, since the very beginning of history, ready to come forth when the time is right. According to one legend, and we know this, right? Tending the wounds at the gates of Rome. Uh, he noted that it could be an AIDS hospice. It could be, people suffering with COVID. Yes. Only when redemption is about to be completed will the Messiah be allowed to arrive. Rather than the Messiah redeeming us, we redeem Messiah. Uh, in other words, what allows the Messiah to be present is the way in which we change our behavior. It is not about any pleading. It is not about um, uh, anything that is decided in heaven. It is not about anything that anyone else is doing in the world. It's all of us creating the road to redemption. And when we begin to experience, the Messiah will come, in a sense, to put a stamp on it. To as we talked about last time, to declare it kosher, to declare it acceptable and appropriate, and we should obviously keep moving in that direction. All right, so now we're going to, okay, this, by the way, really struck me. This was in one of the articles that I was using for research. And it's a mosaic in Jerusalem's Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Ascension, depicting, of course, Jesus's crucifixion. Now, did that actually happen? Well, obviously there are all kinds of people doing all kinds of research, and have been for years. One of the difficulties is that we don't really have much archaeological evidence of Jesus. We do have textual indications that Jesus was here. He's talked about in the Mishnah. He's talked about in the Talmud. They refer about half a dozen times to someone named Yeshu, whom we assume is Jesus, but one also has to be clear that just like at the time when, the first temple was destroyed, when we get to the Romans trying to crush an initial rebellion against them, not the Bar Kokhba one that happened later, one that happened earlier, excuse me, and they decided to clamp down on the Jewish people, that new emergences of leaders who were charismatic and had followers, that was a threat to the Roman government. Now, the crucifix that we're looking at was never, ever, ever a methodology of Jewish execution. This is only something that the Romans did. So no, the Jews did not crucify Jesus. We did not kill Jesus. Even though the book of Matthew says it this way, the Gospel of Matthew says it this way, we really didn't advocate for the killing of Jesus. Jesus was, for the rabbis, and I don't say this pejoratively, a kind of a marginal figure. He was considered to be a teacher, a good teacher, actually, an itinerant teacher. What it did bother the rabbis when people began to look at him as the Messiah. And by the way, this image of Jesus is a European image of Jesus, and most people native to the Middle East, to Israel at that point, were much darker. Their hair was much kinkier. So, a lot of these images, are not something that we can, rely on. At any rate, when The Romans, that is pretty much why they crucified him next to two common criminals, because they considered him to be the same thing. He was a threat to the regime. He was an instability, and so they killed him. Now, it was also, I mean, this is not new to you, because I know that Pastor Eric teaches this as well. Jesus was born as a Jew and lived as a Jew and died as a Jew. And most of his disciples, certainly at the very beginning, were doing the very same thing. So we do believe that he is historic. Now, historicity is going to be a problem. When we try and hone in on the historical figure of Jesus, because the four Gospels were written decades after Jesus lived. And as you know, I mean, well, first of all, they did not have the kind of technology and communication that we have now. There were many stories that were being written about Jesus, or let's put it this way, spoken about Jesus. So first, all of these, just like what happened with the Hebrew Testament, the First Testament, what happened was is that it was all oral, and there were versions and versions and versions, and then it had to be redacted, and it was redacted under these, under these four names, whether or not they were each individuals or schools of thought, again, we really don't know. There's a wonderful book called Gospel Parallels, which takes all the Gospels and literally puts them in columns, all four columns next to each other, talking about the same thing. And the narration gets a little bit different in each one of them. And so one has to ask, what exactly did happen? And ultimately, for you as Christians, it doesn't matter exactly what happened, right? Because your church is built on the assumption that all of those narratives coordinate, and they're all really telling exactly the same story. Everything is as it is, and as it was, and as it is supposed to be, according to the predictions about Jesus returning again. Israel, as I mentioned before, before the temple was destroyed the first time and the temple was destroyed the second time, was just in turmoil. If anything about our understanding of when Jesus lived is correct, he died about 35 years or so before the temple was destroyed. So Judaism was in upheaval, and there was a lot of sectarian infighting, and the priests were, as is said in the New Testament, were becoming puppets of the Roman government and trying to hang on to their own influence and their own power. And there was a movement with a group of scholars who would later be called rabbis. They would not be called rabbis until the destruction of the temple. So Jesus, by the way, should not be called a rabbi, because there weren't rabbis yet. Rabbi is a specific title that actually replaced, in a sense, the priestly leadership of the people. And the rabbis were not the kind of people who would try and undermine the authority of the priests, even though they thought they were not operating full bore and not operating above the table all the time. So, but they respected the institution of the temple. They respected the institution of the priests. They believed later in the rebuilding of the temple and the reestablishment of the priestly cult and so on and so forth. But they would never, ever call themselves anything that would override, that authority. So there were, there were the Pharisees, there were the Sadducees, there were the Essenes. All of these people were indeed fighting against one another within Judaism to try and find the strongest expression of Judaism and Jewish culture and Jewish peoplehood that in a transcendent sense would resist the Romans, that would not allow a Roman victory. And I said that to you already. Good. I'm looking at my notes. Excuse me. Okay. So let's talk about the beginnings of Christianity and the Jewish community of which they were a part. The disciples of Jesus and those who were somehow related to the disciples of Jesus had made a commitment to this notion that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, who had come to the world to bring peace, to bring tranquility, to bring stability, to bring righteousness, to bring justice, an end to war, an end to illness, so on and so forth. And then he was executed by the Romans. Now, these are Jews, remember, who are believing this. And they knew what the tradition said. It's pretty much what Maimonides, said several hundred years later. It was pretty much extant at that time as well, that if this person did not fulfill that, and by the way, this is all material and expectations that was added on to the definition of the Messiah. It wasn't original, as we saw. Originally, it was just supposed to be a king, right? But if this person did not become the king of the Jews, in fact was wearing, as he is here, a crown of thorns placed on him by the Romans to satirize the fact that he thought either he thought he was king or his disciples thought he was king. Again, we're not exactly clear on that, because you may know that famous line when Pontius Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he says, "You have said so." He never says, "Yes, I am." And he doesn't so much declare it to his disciples as supposedly Bar Kokhba did several centuries later, or about a century and a half later. So the disciples were Jews faced with a problem in their theological approach to this man, because everything that he was supposed to be fulfilled wasn't fulfilled yet, at least as far as they were concerned. And again, I am not saying this pejoratively. I'm saying that one of the beautiful reasons that the whole notion of Jesus rising from the grave and becoming the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost, who is in our world, outside of our world, and within the world as well, will be revealed again as a flesh and blood personage. That happened because the Jewish disciples got stuck. They got stuck. They had to believe that Jesus would rise again, because they knew that he had to have an opportunity to fulfill that definition of the Messiah. Now, it is absolutely beautiful. It is something that I have seen, transform people and transform their lives. And even after they are believing Christians, be transformed, certainly by the Eucharist and so on and so forth. I've seen it. I understand it. And you need to understand that for us and for Christians, this was the beginning of what would be called Christianity. After Jesus died, the belief that he rose again and rose from the grave and would be returning to fulfill his mission. Now, again, I'm not trying to say this pejoratively. It's that the majority of the Jewish community did not come along with that, and so Christianity developed with a heritage in Judaism, certainly, and there are all kinds of echoes and whispers in that, but also needed to make a real shift, a paradigm shift, to begin to worship this man who had lived in human form, who the believers began to feel was divine, and in fact a part of the divine, and a continuation of a theological history that Jews just didn't accept, and again, because we didn't see Jesus as fulfilling the definition of the Messiah. We didn't feel that Bar Kokhba fulfilled the definition of the Messiah either. So, we parted ways with many, many, many people who came along and said that they were the Messiah, or groups of people believed they were the Messiah. To this day, there are certain groups of Hasidic Jews who believe that their deceased leader will come back because he is indeed the Messiah. Most Jews don't accept that because that whole notion of returning or not really dying is not part of the Messiah understanding. Most Jews today, outside of the Orthodox, most Jews today are really going to believe much more of that notion of a messianic age rather than a Messiah, and that we indeed will make that age happen. There is, I'm not sure if I have time to read this, but I would love, it's a little long, I'd love to read you this story. Well, I'll tell you the story. The story was written by a colleague of mine, Arthur Waskow, and his wife, another colleague of mine, Phyllis Ocean. And they tell the story of a Hasid, a student of a rabbi. He's outside of Israel, but his rabbi is in Israel, and he comes to visit his rabbi in Israel, in the holy city of Tzfat, or Safed, as you may have seen it written, up north in Israel on the coast. A really beautiful, beautiful, ancient city, the ancient seat of Jewish mysticism. So in this city, there are synagogues that are attached to each rabbi, rabbis that have since gone on and rabbis that are now present. So he comes to visit his rabbi, and he sees the rabbi up on a ladder, painting a picture on the ceiling of the synagogue. And the picture he's painting is of the golden dome of the rock, the Muslim, one of the holiest Muslim sites in the world, that is now a mosque surrounding a huge, huge rock that is said to be the rock upon which Abraham almost slew his son Isaac, excuse me, and also the same rock from which Muhammad's horse leapt into heaven, where he received the basic principles of Islam. So a very important place, beautiful place. And by the way, the gold tiles on it now are real gold. They used to be gold plate, but the first King Hussein of Jordan really wanted them to be real gold. So before he died, he made sure that they were. This is an incredibly holy place for the Muslims. And the Hasid says, well, you know, Rabbi, why are you painting a mosque, this holy mosque, this special mosque, on you know, the temples, on your synagogue's ceiling? He says, because I believe that something important is about to happen. And sure enough, something important does happen. The Messiah comes. And the rabbi runs, and his student runs, and everybody runs to go greet the Messiah. And the Messiah says, we're going up to the Temple Mount. Now, this platform that you see behind you here, right? Just underneath the caption, yeah? The platform is where the temple was, where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are now. And the major part of the temple that was destroyed is underneath this platform. Orthodox Jews will not go there now because they are afraid that they will enter the Holy of Holies somehow. And they don't want to enter the Holy of Holies, so because they're not allowed to, because they're not priests, and so they stay away. But the Messiah says, come on, we're all going up. And they figured if the Messiah says so, they're all going up. And when they get up there, they meet an equally numerous group of Muslims who are standing there in resistance, trying to keep the Jews away from their holy place. And in the story that they tell, it says that one of the Muslims pulls out a weapon and one of the Jews pulls out a weapon, and you know, that weapon is taken away by fellow Muslims and fellow Jews, but they're still angry with each other and shouting with each other. And finally, the Messiah says, I have come to this place because the Holy Temple is here. And the Jews say, we know it's here. It's underneath your feet. It's down below that platform. It's down below the plaza. That's where it is. They have desecrated this place by building, you know, this dome with gold. And the Messiah says, no, they haven't desecrated it. That is our new temple. Because of course, when the Messiah comes, the temple will be rebuilt. And so the Jews are stunned that the mosque is their temple. And the Muslims are stunned that the mosque is the holy temple of the Jews. Until, of course, the Messiah convinces them that, you know, indeed, the Muslims, in building their mosque to consecrate their idea of what is holy and their idea of prophetic wisdom and their idea of righteousness, was indeed also at the same time the new temple for the Jewish people. It's a beautiful, what we would call a drash, a folkloric tale. And on the other hand, I think it says a great deal. It says that the concept for the Jewish people of the Messiah keeps evolving. And it keeps expanding and growing in some sense. But in any way that you look at it, the common denominator now for progressive Jews, not for the Orthodox who are still literally waiting for a personage to come, again, not to return, but to come for the first and only time, for progressive Jews of the Reform ilk, conservative ilk, Reconstructionist ilk, et cetera, what we're not waiting for something. We are engaging in the work that will create the possibility for the Messiah to be revealed. A wonderful poet named Danny Siegel said that you know, every person should treat the person next to him or her as if that person was the Messiah, waiting for a little bit of human kindness in order to be revealed. And then he says, and if it turns out that that person is not the Messiah, it will not matter, because we will be behaving messianic already. So again, just to kind of wrap up and see if there's any questions from the group, um, the notion is that there's a little bit of the potential for the Messiah in each of us. And we have a great deal of work to do in order to make that possibility happen. And when it happens, it won't be anything new, because we will have been living it already. Like I said, it will be stamped, consecrated, by the notion that this is now the messianic time. Okay, so some questions, some answers. Okay, there's got to be more.
Why don't you get away from the screen and take your
Yeah, that'll
screenshot?
do it. Okay, great.
There you go.
Get rid of that one.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
All right. So, how much of this was new for you?
A lot of it.
Yeah, a lot of it was new from the Jewish perspective of how they viewed historically the Messiah.
Say it again?
I said a lot of it was new, having the Jewish perspective.
Okay.
All right.
How is this the first time that you've had a chance to speak to a Christian group about the Jewish perspective of Messiah?
No, not the first. I was once asked to help with a Passover Seder at a church around Passover time. I was asked to lead it, actually, and I said, I'd rather explain what we do, right, rather than do something that's sort of a mix of Judaism and Christianity. And they said, fine. And one of the things that we need to recognize is that both Easter and Passover came out of the same pressure on the community, that in as much as Christianity was emerging, the persecution of the Romans became intimate with and powerful in the Jesus story and the story of the Messiah and redemption. And for Jews, we don't have any record of, if we ever do a Passover, I'll tell you about this too, but we don't have any record of the Seder before the destruction of the Second Temple. So
it was all oral.
Well, it was done differently.
Oh, it was.
In other words, it was exactly what the Torah said. You come to the temple in Jerusalem, you make pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem. You either buy an animal there to get sacrificed, a lamb, right? Or you bring one with you. The priest sacrifice most of the animal, give you some back. You take some bitter herbs and some unleavened bread, and you sit and you have a picnic and you tell the kids a story. You tell them the story of the Jewish people, right? But we know that the Passover Seder as such, just, and chicken and egg, who knows? Passover Seder, Last Supper, we don't really know. But it's clear that the Passover Seder is a messianic institution, because at the end, everybody proclaims next year in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. And that will only happen when the Messiah comes.
Mhm.
Okay. So, and so there is all of this parallel sense of redemption going on, right? You know, on the one side of Jesus, you know, predicting, you know, his own death and actually instituting the Eucharist at that dinner, right? Um, uh, and then he doesn't die, right? And that's what's celebrated on Easter, right? That
Right.
somehow he continues, just like he's continuing in your lives. I mean, and you talk about this all the time, and it's a real presence for you. And the Jewish people was waiting for that redemption at that point, right? We were exiled again. This would be the beginning of 2,000 years of exile for us.
Mhm.
And
And
it
so
really-
everything changed. Judaism changed. Everything changed at that moment.
And there's a seat at the Seder table, isn't there, for Elijah?
Absolutely.
Kind of
There's
symbolizes that
there's
redemption.
a
that
glass of
we're waiting
wine.
for. Yeah,
There's a glass of wine.
glass of wine, right.
Glass of wine. Some
And
people
doors
go
left
to the
open.
magic store and get one of those wine cups that, you know, you can trick people and so it goes down and look, he's here.
Leftover wine?
Pardon me?
Leftover wine?
Not leftover wine. No, we give Elijah the best. But you know, the other thing is okay. I'll do it really, really quickly. On our Seder plate, we have something green, right? All of this gets mixed into some of the imagery of Easter baskets and the greenery in the Easter basket and so on and so forth. Okay, and green is always about
Spring.
living forever, right? It's about ever life. Okay, eternal life, which Jesus embodies. Okay. Just like at Christmas, you have a bookend at Easter of the greenery. Okay. We have an egg on our plate. You have eggs in the Easter basket, right? They are really about the same thing, about the springtime and fertility and things moving forward and not being stopped and so on and so forth. And we have we have a lamb bone, right? That's not at the Last Supper Seder because Jesus is the lamb, right? Jesus is the lamb. Yeah.
Okay, Neil, shall we wrap it and then see whether you have anything else?
Well, very clearly, Susan and I would like to express our gratitude, Rabbi, for your commitment to this series, to the time that you've devoted to instructing us in the ways and beliefs in Judaism and your participation in our congregation. We're very, very grateful.
Well, I walked in, but Pastor Schaefer opened the door, and it was just a beautiful gesture.
We call that the Schaefer hook.
Yeah, okay. All right, folks, that's enough. We better turn off this recording now. So we have 2 more weeks, Neil.
Yes, we do.
And then we'll gather next week and the week after, and then we will
And then we'll
have
move on to something new.
something new.
Very
All
good.
right. Thank
Okay.
you, everybody.
Odavo shalom aleinu, Odavo shalom aleinu, Yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kula.